Welcome dear students. In the current session, I am going to talk about Middle English syntax. I hope and expect that by the end of this session, you would understand the nature of syntax that was used in Middle English. You would also be able to see what kind of developments occurred from Old English to Middle English. Well, my dear students, leveling of inflections had a very strong impact on Middle English language. This was a major shift that happened from Old English to Middle English. And this leveling had an impact on various aspects of language. So, for instance, the drop of grammatical gender, for example, all the other changes that came in the formation of adjectives, of nouns, of verbs, etc., they were somehow linked to dropping of these inflections. Now, when it comes to the syntax of Middle English, these leveling of inflections also had a connection with, or a connectivity with, this process of change in syntax. In fact, leveling of inflections resulted in syntactic and semantic relationships that had been signaled by the endings on words, now becoming far more ambiguous. Whereas in Old English, the grammatical functions of two consecutive nouns were clear from their endings. For example, nominative and dative cases. In Middle English, their functions might not be certain. So, this dropping of inflections had a result that was of uncertainty and ambiguity in, those options. The most direct way to avoid this kind of ambiguity is through limiting the possible patterns of word order. Now, how did language find a solution to that? When people use language, when there are certain problems, of course, it is through the usage that as people find it suitable to fix those problems, they start using it like that, and this usage determines the change in language. Same happens with the syntax of Middle English language. So the most direct way that was used to avoid that was that there were certain limitations that were imposed on the syntax or the structure of Middle English. Highly synthetic stage of Old English now moved towards a highly analytic stage of late Middle English, which finally would lead towards modern English. What can be the process of this development? If we think about this question, actually we can see it through certain texts as well. But before I show you what I mean by a particular text that would help you identify those, let me make it clear that in Old English, there were particular varieties of syntax that were available, and actually they were quite available with all the freedom to use. Now, Middle English put a restriction on that, and certain structures were not allowed to be used. Here we can see this development where the limitations were put on the structures in Peterborough Chronicle. This Peterborough Chronicle was in fact a long text that was written in installments. If you look at the dates during which it was written, it was from 1070 to 1154. So, it was a long period of, almost 3/4 parts of a century. This text of Anglo-Saxon chronide spans the period from Old English, and it moves through switches to Middle English. In the contributions of the text, as we look at, the most significant part is that it documents what was happening in Old English, and it also provides instances of what was happening in terms of syntax in Middle English. The continuations of the text make it possible actually to trace this development. First of all, we notice the significant loss of inflections in this text. Afterwards, what we notice is a corresponding rigidity of word order, making clear the direction of cause and effect. Process of development and the reality of Middle English as a separate stage of the language, with all, its signs of the changes grammatically, phonologically, and lexically, can be seen in the patterns of subject-verb order that we find in the Middle English text, any text generally, and this particular text specifically. Well, my dear students, modern English order is of subject-verb. When we compare and contrast it with Old English allowed subject-verb plus verb-subject in subordinate clauses. Subject-verb with the finite verb in final position in that case. All of these patterns, that Old English allowed, they are still found in this particular text, and they are possible even in the last years of this text as it was written. Thus, the word order looked much like that of Old English at a time when the inflectional system looked much like that of modern English. As Bruce Mitchell writes, the language of Peterborough's Cronide, 1122 to 1154, is middle. In its nature, it is middle, not modern English. It is transitional. And I think this is the most important factor that we need to notice. It is transitional. It was passing through a stage of change. These changes, which affected the grammatical structure of English after the Norman Conquest, were not the result of contact with the French language. Certain idioms and syntactic usages, they appeared in Middle English. They are clearly the result of this contact. But as we see before our eyes how English was developing, how English is beginning to change from synthetic language to an analytical language, we can notice that, in fact, the decay of inflections and the confusion of forms has nothing directly to do with the syntax, has nothing directly to do with the Norman Conquest, though indirectly they were related. How? Because they actually created all those situations, they created all those circumstances in which these changes were possible. Norman Conquest can be equated with removal of authority of having a standard variety, the freedom that it gave to use language the way people wanted to use it. What happened as a result? It made easier for grammatical changes to go forward unchecked.